Racist cops shoot deaf black girl. Her father arrives. With the FBI and ends their careers. What if the quiet sound of evening traffic outside your window was suddenly broken by the wail of sirens? And when you look closer, you realized it wasn't just another routine stop, but something that would shake a whole community forever. Picture a small town where neighbors know each other by name, where the diner serves coffee that tastes the same as it did 30 years ago, and where people still wave from their porches. It's the kind of place where folks expect fairness, where dignity matters. But in one tense moment, that trust was shattered. A young girl, misunderstood in the most heartbreaking way, became the center of a storm no family should ever have to face. And standing in that silence afterward was her father, a man whose steady hands had held her since birth, now trembling with a grief that demanded answers. "Where are you watching from tonight?" The summer had been long and heavy, the kind where the air felt thick even after the sun went down. Folks in Willow Creek often left their windows open at night, hoping a breeze might slip in through the screens. On one such evening, Samuel Hayes sat at his kitchen table with a worn photograph resting between his fingers. It showed his daughter Jasmine, at 6 years old, grinning in front of a lemonade stand, her curls tied back with a red ribbon. Now she was 15, taller, sharper, but still carrying that same light in her smile. To him, she was more than his only child. She was the reason he had kept steady after losing his wife years earlier. Jasmine had been born deaf. Samuel still remembered the day the doctor explained it to him, carefully, with charts and gentle pauses. At first, his world had tilted. He wondered how she would navigate a world that often failed to listen even to those who could speak. But as Jasmine grew, she taught him that silence could be just as powerful as words. Together, they learned American Sign Language, filling their home with hands that spoke volumes. Samuel's broad fingers, once clumsy from years of carpentry, became precise and graceful when signing with her. Their bond was unshakable. Every evening after dinner, Jasmine would sit at the table with her sketchbook, drawing whatever had caught her eye that day. Sometimes it was the neighbor's dog chasing fireflies. Sometimes it was the way the sun filtered through the maple tree in their front yard. Samuel would sip his coffee, glance at her sketches, and marvel at the way she saw the world. She noticed details most people overlooked. In a town like Willow Creek, people thought they knew everyone's story. But Jasmine's silence often made others impatient. Teachers sometimes underestimated her, assuming she couldn't keep up. Strangers mistook her quietness for defiance. Samuel tried to shield her from that, reminding her every night, "You're not broken, sweetheart. The world just doesn't always know how to listen." She would smile, nod, and keep drawing. That evening, Jasmine asked if she could walk to the corner store to pick up some art supplies. It was just a few blocks away, and she liked the independence. Samuel hesitated, fathers always do, but finally nodded. "Be careful. Stick to the sidewalk, and come straight home." She gave him a thumbs up and slipped out the door, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. At the same time, 2 officers were cruising through town in a squad car. Officer Grant, a man in his 40s with a jaw set like concrete, had been on the force for nearly 20 years. His partner, Officer Mills, younger and still eager to impress, often followed Grant's lead without question. Both had reputations. Grant for being tough but fair, according to some, though others whispered he had a temper when dealing with minorities. Mills was quieter, but his silence rarely meant resistance. They spotted Jasmine walking near the store, her head down, flipping through her sketchbook as she walked. Grant slowed the car. "What's she doing out this late?" he muttered. "Looks like just a kid," Mills replied. Grant frowned. "Something's off. Look at the way she's ignoring us." When they pulled up beside her, Jasmine didn't notice right away. She was tracing over one of her drawings with her pencil, caught in her own world. Grant rolled down the window and barked, "Hey! Stop right there!" Jasmine flinched, startled by the sudden voice, but didn't respond. She glanced up briefly, confused, then looked back down. Her hearing aids were tucked in her pocket. She preferred the comfort of silence when she was alone. Grant scowled. She's ignoring me. Mills shifted uncomfortably. Maybe she didn't hear you. Don't be naive. She heard. Grant opened his door and stepped out. Jasmine, sensing movement, looked up again. The officer was approaching, his flashlight beam cutting across her face. She froze, unsure what to do. Her hands lifted instinctively, beginning to sign, but Grant misread the motion. "Hands where I can see 'em," he barked. Jasmine's heart pounded. She tried again, signing slowly, "I'm deaf." But her gestures only seemed to agitate him further. Mills stepped out now, hovering by the car. "Grant, maybe," but Grant was already reaching for his holster. Jasmine, frightened, clutched her sketchbook to her chest like a shield. The flashlight caught the spiral binding, and for a split second, Grant's mind twisted the image into something dangerous. "Drop it," he shouted. She shook her head, tears welling. She couldn't drop her drawings. They were her voice. The situation spiraled in seconds. Grant fired. The sound cracked through the night air, echoing down the quiet street. Jasmine fell, her sketchbook tumbling beside her, pages scattering like leaves in the wind. Mills froze, his face pale. Neighbors stepped onto porches, drawn by the noise. One woman screamed. A man shouted, "What are you doing?" "She's just a girl." Samuel heard it from his kitchen. The siren's wail had carried faintly, but the gunshot was unmistakable. His mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Without thinking, he ran toward the sound, his legs carrying him faster than they had in years. When he reached the corner, the sight stole his breath. Jasmine lay on the ground, motionless, her sketchbook spread open to a half-finished drawing of their maple tree. Officers loomed above her, their guns still drawn. Samuel's knees buckled. He fell beside her, gathering her limp body into his arms, his hands trembling as they brushed the curls from her face. "No, no, baby girl, please." His voice cracked, carrying the weight of every prayer he had ever whispered into the silence of their home. The crowd was gathering now, phones out, voices rising. Mills stammered something about perceived threat, but his words were drowned out by the wails of neighbors who knew Jasmine, who had seen her grow up on this very street. Samuel's grief hardened into something else, a resolve he had never known before. He lifted his eyes to the officers, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his chest. "You will answer for this." In that moment, Samuel Hayes wasn't just a father. He was a man standing at the crossroads of love and justice, and the path ahead would demand every ounce of strength he had left. The night bled into chaos. Red and blue lights flashed against the houses of Willow Creek, washing the quiet street in a carnival of sorrow. Neighbors crowded close, some shouting, others weeping, many holding up their phones to capture what their hearts could hardly process. For years, Willow Creek had been the sort of town that pretended tragedy belonged elsewhere, the kind you saw on the news, but never on your own corner. That illusion shattered with the echo of Grant's gun. Samuel sat on the curb, with Jasmine's head resting on his lap. A neighbor had rushed to fetch blankets, and someone else tried to kneel with a first aid kit, but it was too late. Jasmine's eyes, once so alive with curiosity, were fixed now in a silence no sign could break. Samuel rocked gently, murmuring words only a father would whisper to a child who could no longer hear them. His big hands, once strong enough to carry lumber and beams, trembled helplessly against her stillness. "Sir, you need to step back," one officer muttered. Voice tight, Samuel lifted his head, his gaze hard as steel. "Don't you dare touch her." The weight in his voice silenced the officer. Around them, murmurs swelled. "She was deaf," a woman cried out. "She couldn't even hear you." Phones captured everything. The flashing lights, the trembling Officer Mills standing off to the side, and Grant's stone face, already rehearsing his defense. In another town, the story might have been buried beneath reports and jargon, but Willow Creek wasn't ready to swallow this one. By morning, the video was everywhere. Local news anchors spoke with grim urgency. A 15-year-old black girl shot by police officers during what appears to be a routine stop. The footage replayed on loop, Jasmine clutching her sketchbook, Grant shouting, then the sharp flash of a gunshot. The media storm erupted. National outlets picked it up, sparking debates across breakfast tables, church halls, and coffee shops. Words like misconduct and systemic failure floated alongside Jasmine's name. But for Samuel, none of the headlines captured the truth. She wasn't a symbol or a case file. She was his daughter, the girl who drew maple trees and tied ribbons in her hair. At the funeral, the church overflowed. Friends, neighbors, teachers all came, many weeping openly. Jasmine lay in a pale blue dress Samuel had chosen, the one she had worn on her last birthday. On the pew beside him sat her sketchbook, salvaged from the street, its pages smudged with blood and graphite. He couldn't bring himself to close it. After the service, reporters waited outside. Microphones crowded him, questions flying. Do you believe the officers should be charged? What do you want from the investigation? Samuel looked into the cameras, his grief plain but his words controlled. I want justice, he said, steady and low. Not revenge, justice. That distinction mattered. And it was the first sign that Samuel Hayes was not an ordinary grieving father. What few people knew was that before he had become a carpenter, before his life was reshaped by fatherhood and loss, Samuel had worked in federal law enforcement. He had spent years with the FBI, specializing in civil rights investigations. He had stepped away after his wife's passing, choosing to raise Jasmine quietly rather than chase cases across the country. Most of Willow Creek knew him only as the quiet man who built cabinets and fixed porches. But now, as his daughter's death shook the nation, those old ties stirred awake. When news reached former colleagues, calls began. By the third day, Samuel was sitting in his living room, surrounded by familiar faces in dark suits. They didn't come as saviors. They came as allies. Sam, we're so sorry, one agent said quietly, clasping his hand. Samuel nodded, his voice low. I won't let her be forgotten. This isn't just about her. It's about every child who was told their silence meant they weren't worth listening to. The agents exchanged glances. Then one spoke. We'll open a civil rights review. Full oversight. Independent investigation. The news broke like a tidal wave. For the first time, the officers' actions wouldn't be judged solely by their local precinct. Federal oversight meant accountability beyond hometown politics. It meant a process Samuel trusted because he had once been part of it. Meanwhile, Willow Creek simmered. Protests filled the streets, led by students carrying Jasmine's sketches printed on posters. One drawing the maple tree became a symbol. Underneath, someone had written, "Her voice lives here." At a town hall, tensions flared. Residents demanded answers. Grant sat stiff in the front row, his lawyer whispering in his ear, while Mills fidgeted beside him, guilt etched deep in his face. Samuel stood at the podium, his voice carrying the weight of his grief without collapsing under it. My daughter wasn't a threat, he said, lifting the sketchbook. She was an artist. She was a child. She deserved patience, not bullets. And if we allow this to pass unchallenged, we say to every parent in this town that their child's life is negotiable. I refuse to say that. The room erupted, some clapping, some shouting. Through it all, Samuel remained still, like a man who had found a purpose larger than his pain. But behind the scenes, resistance was forming. Local officials bristled at the FBI's involvement. Statements trickled out, carefully worded. The officer perceived a threat. Procedures were followed. We urge calm while the investigation unfolds. Samuel recognized the language. He had once written similar lines himself, meant to quiet storms rather than confront them. Now he saw them for what they were, shields against accountability. The twist of it all came a week later. A leaked body cam clip revealed what the officers had seen. Grant's flashlight beam reflecting off the spiral of Jasmine's sketchbook, his voice rising, Mills hesitating. But more importantly, the audio caught Samuel's daughter's last, desperate attempt at communication. Her hands moving in jagged, terrified signs. I'm deaf, please. The footage stunned the public. Experts translated her signs on national television, breaking hearts all over the country. She was telling them she couldn't hear, one interpreter explained, voice heavy with sorrow. And they shot her anyway. The revelation shifted everything. What had been debated as a tragic misunderstanding was now a stark indictment of bias and impatience. And Samuel, though shattered inside, became the reluctant voice at the center. "If this moment touched your heart," a reporter whispered to viewers after playing the footage, "please give this story your attention, your voice, your demand for change." Samuel didn't ask for followers or fame. He asked for dignity, and that quiet insistence began to reshape the narrative, not just a tragedy, but a turning point. Still, he knew this was only the beginning. The hardest battles weren't waged in protests or on screens. They unfolded in hearings, in depositions, in rooms where policy and prejudice collided. And Samuel was ready to walk into every one of them, because Jasmine had been silenced forever, but through him. Her story was only beginning to speak. The days following the release of the body cam footage were heavy with tension. Willow Creek, once a sleepy town, now felt like it stood under a magnifying glass. Reporters lined the sidewalks, satellite trucks cluttered the church parking lot, and every conversation in the diner seemed to circle back to one name: Jasmine Hayes. For Samuel, mornings were the hardest. He would wake expecting to hear the faint rustle of sketchbook pages from his daughter's room, only to remember that the silence was permanent now. He sat at the edge of her bed one dawn, the quilt still creased from the last night she slept there. On the nightstand lay the bracelet she always wore, woven threads of red and blue, frayed from years of use. He picked it up, turned it over in his palm, and closed his eyes. "Lord, I don't know how to walk through this," he whispered. "But I have to." There were moments when anger threatened to consume him. He would replay the shooting in his mind, wondering if he should have walked with her that night, if one decision could have changed everything. But anger alone, he knew, would destroy him. He'd seen it happen to others. Cases where grief turned to bitterness, where families were broken twice, once by tragedy and again by hate. He refused to let that be Jasmine's legacy. Still, the world outside his door wasn't so patient. One afternoon, a group gathered on the courthouse steps, holding signs that read, "Justice for Jasmine." Across the street, another group carried banners with "Support our officers." The two crowds shouted across the divide, their words sharp and cutting. Samuel stood in the middle, weary of both extremes. He wanted justice, yes, but not in the form of slogans or rage-filled clashes. He wanted change that endured beyond the news cycle. That night, his oldest friend, Pastor Williams, came by. The pastor was a tall man, with a soft voice that carried surprising weight. He brought a casserole, because that was what people in Willow Creek did when words weren't enough. Samuel didn't eat, but he listened as William spoke. "Sam, grief can drown a man, but it can also sharpen him. I've watched you carry your daughter's silence with more grace than most men could manage. Don't let them take that away from you," Samuel sighed. "It feels like I'm already losing her again. The world's arguing over her name, but no one knew her laugh. No one knew how she'd tug my sleeve when she wanted me to notice the sunset." The pastor leaned forward. "Then you tell them. You be her voice, not just in courtrooms and hearings. In every room where people still don't understand what it means to listen." Those words settled deep into Samuel's bones. The next day, a hearing was called to determine whether Officer Grant would be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The courthouse was packed. Reporters filled the back row, notebooks ready. Grant entered stiffly, his lawyer at his side, while Mills kept his eyes downcast, avoiding Samuel's gaze. When it was Samuel's turn to speak, he walked to the front with Jasmine's sketchbook tucked under his arm. He placed it gently on the table before him, then rested his hand on it, as if drawing strength. "My daughter communicated with her hands," he said slowly, looking at the panel. "She signed 'I'm deaf' in the moments before she was shot. You've seen the footage. You've read the transcripts. She told them who she was. And yet here we are debating whether procedure was followed." He paused, his voice tightening, then steadied himself. "Procedure means nothing if it doesn't protect the vulnerable. If it can't pause long enough for a child to be understood, then it isn't procedure. It's failure." The room went still. Even the officers shifted uncomfortably. Samuel's words didn't accuse blindly. They revealed a truth too painful to ignore. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with tension. Supporters approached him, some with tears in their eyes, thanking him for his courage. But there were others too, men muttering about playing the race card or making cops afraid to do their jobs. Samuel didn't respond. He had no room for arguments built on fear. That night, he sat alone at the kitchen table, the sketchbook open before him. Page after page of Jasmine's drawings stared back. Birds in flight, the curve of their old dog's tail, the weathered boards of their porch. Each sketch was a memory, frozen. He traced one with his fingertip, feeling both the ache of loss and the stubborn spark of love that refused to fade. It was then he understood. Jasmine's life wasn't just taken. It had been offered back to him as a charge, to speak, to fight, to change, not through vengeance, but through the same steady dignity he had always tried to model for her. The turning point came in the form of a phone call. Late one evening, the FBI's Civil Rights Division asked him to join a task force reviewing not only Jasmine's case, but broader training failures across the state. They wanted him to testify, to help craft reforms that might prevent another tragedy. Samuel stared at the phone, silent. This wasn't the path he would have chosen. He would have given anything to simply have his daughter back, to never hear of task forces or hearings again. But he also knew he couldn't stand still while others walked into the same storm, unprepared. Yes, he finally said, "I'll do it." From that night forward, his grief had a direction. He began preparing testimony, collecting stories from other parents who had faced silence where there should have been understanding. He met with interpreters, advocates for the deaf community, and attorneys who had fought similar battles. Slowly, piece by piece, his sorrow began shaping itself into purpose. At church the following Sunday, Samuel stood to speak. The congregation, still raw with grief, leaned in. "Justice isn't vengeance," he told them. "It's making sure no one else has to stand where I stood, holding their child in the street while the world argued over excuses. Justice is patient, justice is steady, and it's worth the fight." The crowd rose, not with the roar of protest, but with the quiet, resolute applause of people who understood. As he sat down, Samuel felt the bracelet still wrapped around his wrist, Jasmine's frayed threads tied firmly against his skin. It was as though she were still tugging his sleeve, still asking him to notice the sunset. And he did. For the first time since the shooting, he stepped outside that evening and watched the sky burn gold and crimson. A silent reminder that beauty, like justice, could still break through. The state capitol building loomed tall, its marble steps echoing with the footsteps of reporters and activists. For Samuel, walking those steps felt heavier than carrying lumber on the hottest summer day. He had testified before in his past career, but this time was different. This wasn't a case file. This wasn't about statistics or unnamed victims. This was his daughter. Inside, the hearing room was packed. Rows of suited officials sat at long tables, their microphones blinking red, papers stacked neatly before them. Behind Samuel, the gallery filled with community members, church friends, deaf advocates, and national media. On one side sat Officer Mills, his expression tight and eyes fixed on the floor. On the other, Grant, his jaw clenched, shoulders squared as if daring the world to question him. When Samuel was called forward, the room hushed. He carried Jasmine's sketchbook, worn now at the edges, and placed it gently on the desk. He adjusted the microphone. "My name is Samuel Hayes," he began, voice calm but resonant. "For years, I served in federal law enforcement. I investigated civil rights violations, and I believed in the system's ability to correct itself when given the chance. Today, I'm not here as an agent. I'm here as a father." He paused, opening the sketchbook to a page with Jasmine's maple tree. He held it up. This was her last drawing. The night she was shot, she carried this book. Officers mistook it for a weapon. But I ask you, does this look like a threat? The image, a simple tree shaded in pencil, filled the screen as cameras zoomed in. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Samuel continued. "My daughter signed the words 'I'm deaf' with her hands. We know this because the body cam captured it." Yet the officer fired. This isn't just a failure of one man's judgment. This is a failure of training, of empathy, of listening. If a child has to fear for her life because she communicates differently, then our system is broken. One of the panelists cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes, what do you propose? Samuel took a breath. First, accountability. Officer Grant made a choice to escalate instead of assess. He must answer for that choice. Second, reform. Every officer should be trained to recognize and respond to people with disabilities, not as potential threats, but as human beings. Third, oversight. Independent review should never be optional when a life is lost. His words were steady, but his eyes brimmed with restrained pain. Across the room, Officer Grant finally spoke, his lawyer nudging him forward. With all due respect, I perceived a threat. The object in her hands. It was a sketchbook, Samuel interrupted, his voice sharp for the first time. And she was 15, deaf, a child. The panel chair rapped the gavel, restoring order. But the exchange had already shifted the room's air. Grant's defense sounded hollow against the weight of Samuel's truth. Next, Mills was asked to testify. His voice trembled. I wanted to step in. I thought maybe she hadn't heard us. But I froze. I let Grant take the lead. He swallowed hard, shame thick in his tone. I'll live with that hesitation for the rest of my life. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, hearing sincerity where there had only been excuses before. Mills's guilt didn't erase the loss, but it cracked the shield of silence that too often protected officers from accountability. The hearing stretched on for hours. Experts, advocates, officers and lawyers all taking turns. Deaf community leaders signed passionately, their interpreters' voices carrying urgency. Parents of other children shared stories of discrimination. Bit by bit, a larger picture formed. Jasmine's death wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern that demanded change. When the gavel finally struck to adjourn, the panel announced its recommendations. Officer Grant would face criminal charges for excessive force and reckless endangerment. Mills would be suspended pending review, and a new statewide policy would mandate disability awareness training for every officer. The gallery erupted, some with applause, some with sobs of relief. Samuel sat still, his hands resting on Jasmine's sketchbook. This was only the beginning. A trial would follow. Reforms would take time. But for the first time since the night of the shooting, he felt the tide turn toward justice. Outside the building, the crowd swelled with reporters. Microphones thrust toward him, voices overlapping. Mr. Hayes, do you feel this is justice? He lifted his eyes, steady. Justice isn't one hearing, one charge, one law. It's the work we keep doing, so that no other father sits where I sit today. My daughter's life can't be returned to me, but her legacy can light the way for others. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows on the Capitol steps, Samuel found himself surrounded by community members. An elderly woman pressed his hand. You spoke for all of us, she whispered. He nodded, humbled. I spoke for her. That evening back home, Samuel sat at the kitchen table with the bracelet still tight around his wrist. He opened the sketchbook again, tracing the lines of the maple tree. For the first time, he didn't feel only grief when he looked at it. He felt resolve. If you've been moved by this journey, he told the cameras still lingering outside his door, remember Jasmine, remember to listen. And let's keep building a world where silence isn't mistaken for defiance. The words weren't planned. They rose naturally, like a father teaching one last lesson through the life of his child. The trial came months later, and by then Willow Creek had changed. The town square bore murals of Jasmine's face, painted by local artists. At the library, her sketchbook pages had been scanned and displayed, with captions explaining what each drawing meant to her. The maple tree, once an ordinary part of the Hayes front yard, was now a gathering place, candles at its roots, ribbons tied around its branches. Her silence had spoken louder than anyone could have imagined. Samuel sat in the courtroom, bracelet snug around his wrist, sketchbook in his lap. The proceedings were long and procedural, but he had expected that. Justice, he often reminded himself, was rarely swift. It was patient, deliberate. Evidence was presented, body cam footage replayed, expert testimony given. And in the end, the verdict came. Guilty. Officer Grant was convicted of reckless use of force and civil rights violations. Mills, though spared prison, was ordered into mandatory training and community service with the deaf community. Samuel didn't cheer. He didn't weep. He simply closed his eyes, whispered his daughter's name, and let the weight of the moment settle. Justice had not resurrected Jasmine, but it had honored her truth. And for Samuel, that mattered. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed again. But this time, Samuel's words were not for headlines. They were for his daughter. Standing beneath the evening sky, he lifted his eyes and said softly, "They heard you, Jasmine. At last, they heard you." Life after the trial was quieter but not empty. Samuel accepted an advisory role with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, focusing on disability awareness. He traveled to academies across the state, speaking to young recruits. He never shouted, never lectured with anger. Instead, he told them about a girl who loved to draw trees, who signed "I'm deaf" with trembling hands, and who deserved a pause instead of a bullet. His voice carried more weight than statistics ever could, because it was carved from love and loss. One afternoon, months later, he stood before a room of cadets. On the screen behind him was Jasmine's sketch of the maple tree. He told them, "If you learn nothing else today, learn this. Silence isn't defiance. Sometimes silence is simply another language, and your job is to listen, even when it isn't spoken in words." The cadets sat in stillness, some nodding, some blinking back tears. Samuel looked out over them and thought of Jasmine tugging his sleeve to notice the sunset. He realized he was doing the same for these young officers, tugging their sleeves, urging them to notice what they might otherwise miss. At home, the maple tree in his yard stood taller, its branches full with the changing seasons. Every year on her birthday, Samuel tied a new ribbon to its limbs, red, blue, sometimes gold. Neighbors joined, adding their own colors, until the tree shimmered like a tapestry of remembrance. Children played nearby, and Samuel often saw them pause to look at the ribbons, asking their parents why they were there. The answers varied, but they all carried the same truth. This tree remembered a girl who should have grown up here. The town itself had shifted. Police cruisers now carried a small decal of interlocking hands, a symbol of partnership with the deaf community. Officers attended workshops led by interpreters and advocates. Schools incorporated deaf awareness into their curricula. Slowly, the culture bent toward listening. Samuel didn't pretend it erased the pain. Some nights, he still woke expecting to hear the scratch of pencil on paper. Sometimes he reached for his phone to text Jasmine before the ache reminded him she would never reply. But grief had become a companion rather than a captor. It walked beside him, steady, reminding him of what was lost while urging him to keep building what remained. On the first anniversary of her death, the town held a memorial. The church bell tolled 15 times, one for each year of Jasmine's life. Samuel stood at the podium, his hands trembling as he opened her sketchbook to the maple tree once more. "Jasmine was my daughter," he began. "But today she belongs to all of you too. Not because she wanted to, but because her story reminds us of what we owe each other: patience, dignity, and the willingness to listen." He looked out at the crowd. Neighbors, officials, strangers who had driven hours just to stand beneath the tree. "I don't ask you to remember her with sorrow. Remember her with action. When you see someone different from yourself, pause, learn, listen. That's how we honor her." The crowd stood, applause mingling with tears. Samuel stepped down, and Pastor Williams embraced him, whispering, "You've carried her well, my friend." Later that evening, Samuel sat alone on the porch. The sun was setting, streaking the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He held Jasmine's bracelet in his palm, its threads more frayed than ever, and tied it gently around a new ribbon on the maple tree. "I carried you once in my arms," he whispered. "Now I carry you in my work, in my words, in the way people listen because of you." The breeze rustled the ribbons, making them dance softly. For a moment, it felt as though Jasmine was there, tugging his sleeve once more. He smiled, tears glistening. "I see it, sweetheart. I see the sunset." And as the sky deepened into twilight, Samuel felt a peace he had long thought impossible. His daughter's silence had become her legacy, a voice that would echo far beyond Willow Creek. And in that quiet, Samuel Hayes finally closed the chapter, not with bitterness, not with rage, but with a father's steady love and a promise fulfilled. If this story touched your heart, his voice carried gently for those listening through their screens, share it, remember it, and let it guide you to listen more carefully tomorrow. The screen faded to black on the image of the maple tree, ribbons swaying, sketchbook open beneath it, because sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones we learn at last to hear.